The Manhattan skyline glittered against the October night, a constellation of ambition and power stretching endlessly into the darkness. Elena Russo stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Vertigo Lounge, a glass of untouched champagne in her hand, watching the city that had both raised and ruined her. 28 floors below, yellow cabs weaved through traffic like restless fireflies, and somewhere in that maze of steel and concrete, ordinary people lived ordinary lives. She envied them. But Elena Russo wasn't her real name. That girl, the one who'd been born Isabella Moretti, had died 10 years ago, buried alongside her father's dignity and her family's future. "You look like you're planning someone's murder." Elena's reflection barely flickered as Cassandra Chen appeared beside her, her best friend's knowing smile visible in the glass. Cassie was the only person in New York who knew the truth, the only thread connecting Isabella to Elena. "Just admiring the view," Elena replied, her voice smooth as silk and twice as expensive. She'd spent years perfecting that tone, confident, detached, utterly in control. Nothing like the screaming, sobbing teenager she'd been when her world collapsed. "Right, and I'm here for the overpriced appetizers." Cassie's dark eyes swept the room behind them, where Manhattan's elite mingled beneath crystal chandeliers, their laughter floating over a string quartet's rendition of Vivaldi. "He's here, you know. Just walked in 5 minutes ago. Southwest corner, surrounded by men in suits that cost more than my car." Elena's fingers tightened imperceptibly around her glass. She didn't turn, didn't allow herself the satisfaction. Not yet. She'd waited 10 years for this. 10 years of planning, preparing, transforming herself from a broken girl into someone who could move in these circles undetected. 10 years of patient, burning hatred. "I know," she said quietly. Of course she knew. Isabella, had built her entire adult life around knowing exactly where Dante Caruso would be at any given moment. The man who'd destroyed her father. The man who'd turned her family's legitimate shipping business into a tool for his criminal empire, then discarded them like trash when her father refused to comply further. The man whose cold ultimatum had driven Antonio Moretti to drink himself to death, while his daughter watched helplessly. Dante Caruso, the king of the New York underworld, though no newspaper would ever print those words. To the public, he was a successful businessman. Real estate, import-export, a dozen legitimate ventures that somehow generated millions, while law enforcement could never quite pin down anything illegal. Everyone knew what he really was. No one could prove it. "You don't have to do this tonight," Cassie said softly, touching Elena's arm. "You've waited this long. Another week, another month. I've waited long enough." The words came out sharper than intended. Elena took a breath, forcing her features back into pleasant neutrality. That was the key to this world. Never let them see the knife until it was already buried in their back. She'd learned that lesson from Dante Caruso himself, even if he didn't know it. "I'm sorry," Elena said, softening. "I'm ready, Cass. Everything's in place. The position at Meridian Consulting puts me in direct contact with his business operations. He has no idea who I am. I made sure of that. Different name, different appearance, different life. Isabella Moretti is dead. Elena Russo is just another ambitious consultant trying to make partner." "And what happens when you succeed?" Cassie's voice carried a note of worry. "When you destroy him the way he destroyed your father? What happens to you then?" Elena finally turned from the window, meeting her friend's eyes. In the warm light of the lounge, she knew she looked every inch the successful professional. Designer dress in midnight blue, dark hair swept up in an elegant twist, minimal jewelry that somehow cost more than most people's monthly rent. She'd learned to dress like them, talk like them, think like them. She'd learned to be invisible in plain sight. "Then I can finally breathe," Elena said simply. Before Cassie could respond, a shift in the room's energy made Elena's pulse quicken. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they modulated, became more careful. The crowd parted with the subtlety of people who knew how to show deference without appearing to defer. And there he was. Dante Caruso moved through the room like he owned it, which, Elena had discovered, he technically did. The Vertigo Lounge was one of 17 high-end establishments under his legitimate holdings. He was taller than she'd expected from surveillance photos, 6'2" or 6'3", with the kind of presence that had nothing to do with physical size. His suit was charcoal gray, immaculately tailored, and even from across the room Elena could see it was custom work. Everything about him spoke of control, from his measured stride to the way his dark eyes cataloged every person, every exit, every potential threat. He was 42 years old. She'd memorized every detail of his life, every business deal, every known associate. She knew he took his coffee black, preferred single malt scotch, and had a reputation for being utterly ruthless in business while maintaining a peculiar code of honor with those who worked for him. She knew he'd built his empire from nothing after his own father's death, that he was unmarried, that rumors suggested a complicated relationship with violence. He avoided it when possible, but when necessary, he was brutally efficient. She knew everything about him except the one thing that mattered, why her father had to die. "Elena," Cassie's voice was urgent now. "He's coming this way." No, not possible. This wasn't the plan. She was supposed to be formally introduced next week at the quarterly business review, supposed to have time to prepare, to rehearse every word and gesture. "Ms. Russo?" The voice was deeper than she'd expected, with the faintest trace of his Italian heritage smoothed by years of American business schools and boardrooms. Elena turned with practiced calm, her expression pleasantly neutral, and found herself looking directly into the eyes of the man she'd sworn to destroy. They were gray. She hadn't known that. The surveillance photos hadn't captured it, that particular shade of storm cloud gray that seemed to see straight through every carefully constructed lie she'd built around herself. "Mr. Caruso." She extended her hand, proud when it didn't shake. "I wasn't expecting to meet you until next week's meeting." His handshake was firm, brief, professional. Marcus mentioned he'd hired someone exceptional for the Meridian account. "I don't like surprises in my business dealings, Ms. Russo. I prefer to know who I'm working with, of course." Marcus Brennan, the senior partner at Meridian Consulting who'd hired her 6 months ago, never knowing she'd engineered the entire opportunity. She'd made herself indispensable, positioned herself perfectly to be assigned to Caruso Holdings' account. "I appreciate the directness," Elena said, her voice steady. 10 years of planning rested on the next few minutes. "I assure you, Mr. Caruso, my work speaks for itself. Meridian has tasked me with streamlining your import operations and identifying inefficiencies in your supply chain management. I take that responsibility seriously." Something flickered in his eyes. Amusement, maybe, or assessment. "Supply chain management, is that what we're calling it?" The words were innocuous, but the implication was clear. He was testing her, seeing if she'd acknowledge the real nature of his business or maintain the comfortable fiction. Elena met his gaze without flinching. "I call it whatever generates the results my clients need while staying within legal parameters. My job is to make your legitimate operations more efficient, Mr. Caruso. What you do with that efficiency is your business." A slight smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Interesting. What is?" "Most people can't look me in the eye when they lie about not knowing exactly who I am. You're either exceptionally brave or exceptionally foolish, Ms. Russo." Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her expression cool. "I'm neither, Mr. Caruso. I'm pragmatic. In my business, I work with all kinds of clients. I've learned that moral judgments interfere with effective consultation. You want your shipping routes optimized and your warehouse logistics improved. I can do that. Whether you're shipping artisanal olive oil or," she paused delicately, "other goods, the logistical principles remain the same." The silence stretched between them, and Elena was acutely aware of Cassie standing frozen beside her, of the men in expensive suits hovering protectively nearby, of the weight of this moment that could either advance her plan or destroy it entirely. Then Dante Caruso laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise even him. "I like you, Ms. Russo. You're honest about being dishonest. It's refreshing." He gestured to one of his associates, who immediately materialized with a business card. "My private number. Call me tomorrow afternoon. I want to discuss the Meridian project directly, not through Marcus's intermediaries." Elena took the card, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. "I'll call at 2 o'clock. 3 would be better. I have another meeting at 2. 3 o'clock then?" He nodded, studying her with those unsettling gray eyes for one more moment before turning away. His entourage moved with him, and just like that, the encounter was over. Elena didn't breathe until he'd crossed to the other side of the room. "Holy shit," Cassie whispered. "Did that just happen? Did you just negotiate with Dante Caruso?" "I negotiated a phone call time," Elena corrected, but her hands were shaking now, adrenaline flooding her system in delayed reaction. She set down her champagne glass before it could slip from her fingers. Nothing more. Ella. Cassie only used her real name when they were completely alone, and even then, barely. "Are you sure about this? He's not what you expected, is he?" No, no, he wasn't. She'd expected a monster, someone whose evil would be obvious, whose face would betray the cruelty that had destroyed her family. Instead, she'd met a man who was intelligent, direct, and possessed a charisma that explained how he'd built an empire. But charisma and intelligence didn't change what he'd done. They didn't bring her father back or restore her family name. They didn't erase the memory of her mother's tears or the shame of losing everything they'd owned. He's exactly what I expected, Elena lied. A criminal with good manners. That doesn't change anything. But even as she said it, tucking his business card into her clutch, she felt something uncomfortable twist in her chest. She'd prepared for many scenarios. For him to be suspicious, aggressive, dismissive. She hadn't prepared for him to be interesting. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Elena networked mechanically, collecting business cards, making small talk with people who might be useful later. Her mind remained fixed on those few minutes of conversation, replaying every word, analyzing every gesture. By midnight, she and Cassie were in a taxi heading back to Elena's apartment in Brooklyn, far from the glittering towers of Manhattan. "You need to eat something," Cassie said, noting Elena's pallor. "And maybe admit that tonight was harder than you expected." Elena leaned her head against the window, watching the city slide past. "Do you know what I remember most about the night my father told me what was happening?" Cassie had heard this story before, but she stayed quiet, letting her friend talk. It was raining. One of those October storms that comes out of nowhere. He'd called me to his study, the one with the big oak desk that had been his father's before him. I was 18, home from my first semester at Columbia. I thought he wanted to hear about my classes. Elena's voice was flat, emotionless. She'd told this story so many times in her head that it had become a script, words divorced from feeling. Instead, he told me we'd lost everything. The business, the house, his reputation. He told me about a man named Dante Caruso, who'd approached him 5 years earlier with a business opportunity. Use the Moretti shipping lines for certain cargo, no questions asked, and profit handsomely. My father refused. So Caruso manufactured a crisis. Delayed shipments, lost containers, suddenly every contract violation that had ever existed was being enforced. Within a year, we were drowning in debt and legal fees. The taxi turned onto the Brooklyn Bridge, and Elena watched the lights reflect on the dark water below. Then Caruso came back with another offer. My father could work for him, legitimize his operations, and in exchange, the problems would disappear. My father was desperate enough to agree. For 4 years he helped Caruso build an empire while dying inside every day. Then he tried to get out, tried to go to the authorities. And that's when her voice caught just slightly. Even after 10 years, this part was hard. That's when the real pressure started. Threats. Accidents that weren't accidents. My father started drinking to cope with the stress, with the guilt. Within 6 months, his liver gave out. The doctors said it was cirrhosis, that the damage had been building for years. But I know the truth. Dante Caruso killed my father as surely as if he'd pulled a trigger. Cassie reached over and squeezed her hand. I know, Ella. I know. The taxi dropped them at Elena's building, a converted warehouse in Dumbo with floor-to-ceiling windows and exposed brick. The kind of place that screamed successful young professional. Everything in Elena's life screamed that now. The right address, the right clothes, the right connections. She'd built Isabella's gravestone with meticulous care. Inside her apartment, Elena kicked off her heels and pulled the business card from her clutch. Simple, expensive cardstock, with raised lettering, Dante Caruso, followed by a single phone number. What are you thinking? Cassie asked, heading to the kitchen to make tea, her solution to every crisis, large or small. I'm thinking, Elena turned the card over in her fingers. I'm thinking I have his private number. In one conversation, I got further than I'd planned to get in a month. He liked me, Cass. Or at least he found me interesting enough to want direct contact. And that's good? That's perfect. It means the plan is working. Elena set the card on her coffee table, staring at it like it might contain answers. I gain his trust, get access to his operations, find evidence of his criminal activities, and destroy him, just like he destroyed my father. Cassie emerged with 2 mugs of chamomile tea, setting one in front of Elena. And if you can't find evidence, he's been operating for 20 years without getting caught. What if he's too careful? Then I'll make him careless. Elena wrapped her hands around the warm mug. Everyone has weaknesses, Cass. I just need to find his. What if his weakness is you? The question hung in the air between them. Elena wanted to laugh it off, to dismiss it as absurd. But she remembered the way Dante Caruso had looked at her, not with the predatory interest of some of the men at that party, but with genuine curiosity, like she was a puzzle he wanted to solve. That would make it easier, Elena said finally. Easier to get close, easier to find what I need. Or easier to get yourself killed. I'm not afraid of him. Maybe you should be. Not because he's a criminal, but because... Cassie hesitated, then pushed forward. Because he's not the cardboard villain you've been building up in your head for 10 years. He's a real person, Ella. Complex, intelligent, apparently capable of charm when he wants to be. What happens if you get close and start to see him as human? Then I'll remind myself of my father's funeral, Elena said sharply. I'll remember my mother's face when we sold our house to pay debts. I'll remember dropping out of Columbia because we couldn't afford tuition. I'll remember all the ways Dante Caruso destroyed my family, and I'll finish what I started. Cassie looked like she wanted to argue further, but instead just sipped her tea. Be careful, Ella. Revenge has a way of consuming the person who pursues it. Don't let it consume you. After Cassie left, Elena stood at her own floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the Manhattan skyline across the river. Somewhere in those towers of glass and steel, Dante Caruso was probably still awake, managing his empire of legitimate businesses and criminal enterprises. Did he ever think about the people he'd destroyed along the way? Did Antonio Moretti's name even register in his memory? Or was her father just one of countless casualties in his rise to power? Elena pulled out her laptop and opened the encrypted folder she'd been building for years. Photos, documents, news articles, business filings, everything she'd been able to compile about Dante Caruso and his operations. She'd studied him the way other people studied for doctoral dissertations, learning his patterns, his preferences, his history. His father, Marco Caruso, had run a small protection racket in Queens before dying in a hit orchestrated by a rival family. Dante had been 19, working his way through NYU's business school while helping his mother run a small restaurant. Within 5 years of his father's death, he'd consolidated the scattered remains of Marco's operation and expanded into legitimate business, using one to mask the other. Now, at 42, he controlled an empire worth hundreds of millions, maybe billions, though the illegal portions were impossible to calculate. He'd never married, though he'd had relationships. He had no children, no obvious heirs. His operation was intensely loyal. People who worked for him stayed for decades, which suggested he treated them well, or scared them sufficiently. Perhaps both. Elena had been searching for the crack in his armor, the vulnerability she could exploit for years. And now, finally, she had her opening. She pulled up a blank document and began typing notes from the evening's encounter. Every detail mattered. The way he'd approached her directly rather than sending an intermediary. The test in his words about supply chain management. The fact that he'd laughed at her calculated honesty. He'd called her interesting. Elena's fingers paused on the keyboard. When was the last time someone had found her interesting rather than useful? When was the last time she'd been herself rather than the carefully crafted persona of Elena Russo? She couldn't remember. The truth was, Isabella Moretti had died 10 years ago, but Elena Russo had never truly lived. She was a ghost, a construct, a weapon shaped for a single purpose. Everything else, the apartment, the career, even her friendship with Cassie, was secondary to the mission of destroying Dante Caruso, and now she was one step closer. Elena saved her notes and closed the laptop. Tomorrow she would call him at 3 o'clock. Tomorrow she would take another step into his world, getting closer to the man who destroyed her family. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. But tonight, alone in her apartment with the city lights glowing through her windows, Elena allowed herself one moment of doubt. One whisper of the question Cassie had planted. What if he's not the monster you need him to be? She thought of her father's study, of the rain against the windows, of the broken man who'd once been Antonio Moretti telling his daughter that he'd lost everything. She thought of his funeral 2 months later, sparsely attended because most people had already distanced themselves from the Moretti family's disgrace. The doubt evaporated, burned away by the familiar heat of hatred. Dante Caruso had destroyed her father. He'd taken a good man and crushed him under the weight of impossible choices and relentless pressure. Whether he'd pulled a trigger or not was irrelevant. He was guilty, and Elena Russo, Isabella Moretti, would make him pay. She just had to get close enough first. Outside, the city continued its restless movement, millions of people pursuing their own goals, fighting their own battles, carrying their own wounds. In one tower, a mobster slept peacefully. In another, his future destroyer plotted his downfall. The game had begun, and Elena had waited too long to lose now. The November rain hammered against the windows of Caruso Holdings' executive offices on the 45th floor of the Sterling building, creating a rhythmic backdrop to the tension in the conference room. Elena sat across from Dante Caruso, spreadsheets and logistics reports scattered across the polished mahogany table between them, aware that every person in this room was analyzing her presence here. This was their 5th meeting in 3 weeks. It hadn't been supposed to happen this way. The plan had been simple: monthly check-ins, gradual trust building, a slow infiltration that would take 6 months, maybe a year. Instead, Dante had requested her presence twice a week, sometimes more, pulling her deeper into his operations than she'd anticipated. "The Port Elizabeth route is bleeding money," Dante said, his finger tracing a line on the quarterly report. 3 delayed shipments in 2 months. That's unacceptable. Elena leaned forward, pulling up her tablet. She'd spent the last 72 hours analyzing every detail of that particular shipping route, cross-referencing manifests with actual delivery times, tracking the chain of custody for every container. What she'd found had surprised her. "It's not the route," she said. "It's your warehouse manager in Elizabeth, Thomas Brennan. He's been systematically delaying shipments by 4 to 6 hours, just enough to miss connection windows but not enough to trigger automatic reviews." The room went silent. Vincent Torres, Dante's head of operations and a man who looked like he bench-pressed small cars for fun, leaned forward. "That's a serious accusation, Ms. Russo." "It's not an accusation. It's data." Elena turned her tablet around, showing the pattern she'd identified. "Look at the timestamps. Every delay corresponds with Brennan's shift. When he's off, shipments run on schedule. When he's working, there's always something. A forklift malfunction, a mislabeled container, paperwork issues. But here's the interesting part." She pulled up another screen, aware of Dante's complete attention on her now. His gray eyes had that quality of absolute focus that made her skin prickle with awareness. She pushed the feeling aside. "The delayed shipments? They're all on the same secondary route. And guess who owns the trucking company that gets the emergency overflow contracts when your primary transport can't make the window?" "Brennan's brother-in-law," Dante said quietly, his voice carrying an edge that made Elena remember exactly who she was sitting across from. "Michael Delaney, East Coast Express Transport. He's been siphoning your business for months. My estimate is that you've lost approximately $200,000 in efficiency costs and overtime fees, while Delaney's company has gained nearly $500,000 in emergency contracts." Vincent whistled low. "Son of a bitch. Tommy's been with us for 8 years. 8 years of loyalty doesn't override evidence," Dante said, still looking at Elena with that unsettling intensity. "Good work, Ms. Russo. Thorough." It wasn't praise, exactly. More an acknowledgement of competence. But something in his tone made Elena's pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "What do you want me to do about Brennan?" Vincent asked, and there was something in his voice that reminded Elena these men weren't having a normal corporate meeting. Thomas Brennan wasn't going to get a severance package and a reference letter. "Nothing yet," Dante said, leaning back in his chair. "Let him think he's still safe. I want to know if he's working alone or if there are others. Ms. Russo, can you run the same analysis on our other warehouse operations?" "Already started," Elena replied. "I should have preliminary results by Friday. Make it Wednesday. I have a meeting with our Port Authority contacts Thursday, and I want this information before then." Elena nodded, adding the compressed timeline to her mental workload. She was already putting in 12-hour days analyzing Dante's operations. Not that she minded. Every hour gave her more access, more information, more ammunition for when the time came to use it. But what struck her, sitting in this room surrounded by men who lived in the gray areas between legal and illegal, was how normal it all felt. They talked about logistics and efficiency, about problem-solving and strategic planning. If you ignored the underlying implications, if you didn't think too hard about what some of those shipments actually contained, it could have been any corporate meeting in Manhattan. That was the most disturbing part. "Gentlemen, give us the room," Dante said suddenly. "Ms. Russo and I need to discuss the broader strategic recommendations." Elena's stomach tightened as Vincent and the other 2 men filed out, leaving her alone with Dante Caruso for the first time since that night at the Vertigo Lounge. The rain continued its assault on the windows, and the city stretched out below them, gray and turbulent. "You're uncomfortable," Dante observed, standing and walking to the bar cart in the corner. "Drink? I'm working. It's 6:47 p.m. You've been working for 11 hours. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal tumbler. Scotch, single malt. It won't impair your judgment, Ms. Russo. Just take the edge off. Elena hesitated, then accepted the glass. He was right. She'd been at the Sterling building since 8 that morning, and her shoulders ached from hunching over her laptop. The scotch burned pleasantly going down, warming her from the inside. Better? Dante asked, returning to his seat but not behind the table this time. He settled into one of the leather chairs by the window, gesturing for her to join him. This was a test, Elena realized. The professional distance of the conference table versus the intimacy of the casual seating area. She could refuse, maintain boundaries, keep this strictly business, or she could accept the shift, demonstrate comfort with proximity, build the trust that would eventually give her access to information she couldn't get from spreadsheets. She sat in the chair across from him, the rain-darkened city providing a dramatic backdrop. "You're very good at your job," Dante said. "Exceptionally good. Marcus tells me you turned down 2 other major accounts to focus exclusively on mine. Why? Because you destroyed my father and I'm going to destroy you. Your operations are complex enough to be interesting," Elena said instead, which was partially true. "Most of my clients want basic efficiency improvements. Your organization requires strategic thinking, real problem solving. It's the kind of challenge I got into consulting to find. And the fact that everyone knows what I really am, that doesn't bother you?" There it was again. The directness that kept catching her off guard. Most people in Dante's position hid behind layers of deniability. He seemed to enjoy acknowledging the truth, at least in private. "Should it?" Elena met his gaze steadily. "My job is to make your legitimate operations more efficient. What happens in the parts of your business I don't see isn't my concern." Plausible deniability. Smart. He swirled the scotch in his glass, studying her with those storm-gray eyes. "But we both know you're not stupid, Ms. Russo. You've been in my warehouses, reviewed my shipping manifests, analyzed my supply chains. You've seen enough to make educated guesses about what moves through my operations." Elena's heart rate picked up, but she kept her voice level. "I've made no guesses, I've drawn no conclusions. I've simply done the job you're paying me to do. Which brings me to my real question." Dante leaned forward slightly, and Elena was suddenly aware of how small the space between them had become. "Why are you really here, Elena?" The sound of her first name in his voice sent an unexpected jolt through her. He'd never used it before. Always Ms. Russo, maintaining professional distance. The shift felt significant. Dangerous. "I don't understand the question." "Yes, you do. You're brilliant at what you do. That much is obvious. You could work for any company in New York, make twice what Meridian is paying you. Instead, you're spending 60-hour weeks analyzing warehouse logistics for a man everyone suspects is a criminal. So I'll ask again, why are you really here?" For a moment, Elena saw herself as he must see her. Young, ambitious, perhaps naive enough to think she could navigate his world without consequences. She could play into that. Use it. Honestly? She took another sip of scotch, buying herself a second to construct the lie. "Because working for someone like you is the fastest way to make a reputation in this city. If I can streamline your operations, prove myself valuable to Dante Caruso, every other company in New York will take me seriously. It's pragmatic careerism, Mr. Caruso. Nothing more complicated than that." He studied her for a long moment, and Elena felt like she was being dissected, analyzed, catalogued. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. A real smile that transformed his face from coldly handsome to something warmer, more human. "You know what? I actually believe you. That's exactly the kind of calculating ambition I can understand." He raised his glass in a small salute. "To pragmatic careerism, then." Elena clinked her glass against his, relief flooding through her even as something else twisted uncomfortably in her chest. Guilt, maybe, at how easily the lie had come. Or worse, disappointment that he'd believed it. "Tell me about Thomas Brennan," she said, changing the subject to safer ground. 8 years is a long time. Were there warning signs before this? Dante's expression shifted back to business mode. "Tommy came to me through Vincent. They grew up together in Queens. His father worked for my father, so there was history, loyalty. I trusted him because Vincent trusted him. And now Vincent is going to feel responsible for the betrayal. Vincent's already planning how to handle it. That's his job." Dante's voice was matter of fact, but Elena caught something underneath. Not quite regret, but acknowledgement of cost. "Loyalty is currency in my world, Elena. More valuable than money, harder to acquire, easier to lose. When someone betrays that loyalty, there are consequences." "What kind of consequences?" Elena asked, then immediately wished she hadn't. She didn't want to know, didn't want confirmation of the violence she knew existed beneath the surface of these polished offices and business meetings. Dante watched her carefully, the kind that ensure others don't make the same mistake, but also, and this might surprise you, the kind that are proportional to the offense. Tommy stole from me, endangered my operations, broke trust. He'll lose his job, his reputation in this industry, and probably his marriage when his wife finds out what he did. But he'll walk away breathing, with his kneecaps intact, because he didn't directly endanger lives or betray me to law enforcement. You have a scale, Elena said slowly. Levels of betrayal, levels of response. Everything has structure, Elena. Even revenge. Especially revenge. He finished his scotch and set the glass aside. The men who work for me know the rules. They know where the lines are and what happens when they cross them. That clarity is what maintains order. Elena thought of her father, of the pressure that had slowly crushed him. And what about the people who never agreed to your rules? The ones who get caught up in your world without choosing it? Something flickered in Dante's expression. Was that guilt? Regret? It was gone too quickly to identify. Collateral damage happens in any war, he said quietly. I try to minimize it, but I won't apologize for protecting what's mine or for building something in a city that's been playing by these rules since long before I was born. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. The rain had softened to a steady patter against the windows and the city lights were beginning to emerge as dusk settled over Manhattan. Elena realized they'd been talking for nearly an hour. No spreadsheets, no logistics reports, just conversation. When had that happened? I should go, she said, standing. I need to start the analysis you requested for Wednesday. Dante stood as well, and they were suddenly close enough that Elena could smell his cologne, something subtle and expensive with notes of cedar and bergamot. You don't have to do this alone, he said. I can have Vincent's team pull the raw data. You shouldn't be working until midnight every night. How do you know I work until midnight? A slight smile. Because the security logs show you leaving this building between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. most nights. You're going to burn out, Elena. The concern in his voice caught her off guard. She'd expected many things from Dante Caruso. Suspicion, calculation, cold efficiency, not genuine worry for her well-being. I can handle it, she said, though the exhaustion was real. Between her regular consulting work and the late nights spent researching Dante's operations for her own purposes, she was running on coffee and determination. I'm sure you can, but you don't have to. He walked her to the door, and Elena was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the way he moved with predatory grace despite his size. Vincent's team will have the warehouse data pulled by tomorrow morning. You focus on the analysis. Deal? It was practical, made sense, would actually make her job easier. So why did it feel like she was accepting something more significant than logistical support? Deal, Elena agreed. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual, giving Elena time to replay the conversation. She'd learned things tonight, about how Dante's organization operated, about his philosophy on loyalty and consequences. But more troublingly, she'd glimpsed the man behind the monster she'd constructed in her imagination. He was intelligent, obviously. She'd known that. But he was also thoughtful in a way she hadn't expected, with a code of ethics that was twisted but internally consistent. He genuinely seemed to care about the well-being of his people, even her, and she'd only been in his orbit for 3 weeks. That was dangerous, because it was easier to hate a cardboard villain than a complex human being. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the street slick and reflective. Elena flagged a taxi and gave the driver her Brooklyn address, then pulled out her phone to find 3 texts from Cassie. Dinner tomorrow? You've been MIA for 2 weeks. Seriously, are you alive? If I don't hear from you by tomorrow, I'm filing a missing persons report. Elena smiled, despite her exhaustion, and typed back, alive, busy, tomorrow works. My place, 7 p.m.? The response came immediately. Finally. I'm bringing Thai food and you're telling me everything. At her apartment, Elena kicked off her heels, changed into yoga pants and an oversized sweater, and opened her laptop. But instead of starting the analysis Dante had requested, she found herself opening the encrypted folder she'd labeled Project Justice, her collection of everything related to her father's destruction. She pulled up the timeline she'd constructed years ago, tracing the arc of Antonio Moretti's downfall, the initial approach from Caruso Holdings, her father's refusal, the sudden cascade of problems with contracts and shipments, the mounting debt, the moment of desperation when her father had agreed to work with Dante. 4 years of complicity that had eaten away at him from the inside, then the attempt to break free, to go to the authorities, and the final pressure that had driven him to drink himself to death. Elena had been so certain of this narrative for so long. Dante Caruso was the villain. Her father was the victim. The story was simple, clear, justified her mission. But sitting in that office tonight, listening to Dante talk about loyalty and structure and proportional consequences, a small doubt had crept in. Not about his guilt, she'd never doubt that, but about the completeness of her understanding. And what about the people who never agreed to your rules? She'd asked. Collateral damage happens in any war. But what if her father hadn't been collateral damage? What if there was more to the story than the version she'd held on to for 10 years? Elena shook her head, physically dispelling the thought. No, she couldn't start second-guessing now, couldn't let Dante's charisma and calculated charm undermine years of certainty. He had destroyed her father. That was the truth she'd built her adult life around. She closed the justice folder and opened a new document, beginning the warehouse analysis Dante had requested. This was why she was here, to get close enough to find the evidence that would destroy him. Every moment of doubt was a betrayal of her father's memory. But 3 hours later, struggling to focus on shipping manifests and efficiency metrics, Elena's mind kept drifting back to that conversation in the office, to the way Dante had said her name, to the concern in his voice when he'd noticed how many hours she was working, to the moment when his smile had transformed his face into something unexpectedly warm. He's a criminal, she reminded herself. He destroyed your family. None of this changes that. But a small traitorous part of her mind whispered back, what if it complicates it? 2 days later, the warehouse in Port Elizabeth was exactly as grim as Elena had expected. Concrete and steel and the smell of diesel fuel, with workers moving efficiently between towering stacks of containers. She stood beside Vincent Torres, both of them watching Thomas Brennan across the facility, unaware his world was about to collapse. You're certain about this? Vincent asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. The data doesn't lie. Elena pulled up her tablet, showing him the updated analysis she'd completed. It's not just Elizabeth. I found similar patterns in Newark and Baltimore. Small inefficiencies always benefiting the same network of subcontractors. Brennan wasn't working alone. He's part of a larger operation skimming from at least 3 of your facilities. Vincent's jaw tightened. How much? Conservatively? About 1.2 million over 18 months. Jesus Christ. He rubbed his face, and for a moment, Elena saw genuine pain there. Tommy's kid is starting college next year. His wife just beat breast cancer. I was at his house 2 weeks ago for Sunday dinner. I'm sorry, Elena said, and meant it. This was the cost of getting close, of seeing these people as human rather than abstract components of a criminal organization. If you want, I can present this to Dante directly. No, Vincent's voice hardened. Tommy's my responsibility. My failure to see what he was doing. I'll handle it. Handle it how? The question came out before Elena could stop it. Vincent looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. Not how you're probably imagining. Dante doesn't run that kind of operation anymore. There'll be a conversation, consequences, but Tommy will walk away. Probably to a different city, definitely broke and unemployed, but alive. Any more? Elena caught the word. What changed? Dante did. About 8 years ago. Vincent seemed to be measuring how much to share. There was an incident. Someone got hurt who shouldn't have. A kid, wrong place, wrong time. Dante called a meeting with all his people, laid down new rules. Minimize collateral damage. Proportional responses. No violence unless absolutely necessary. Some of the old school guys left, thought he was going soft. But the ones who stayed? We built something more sustainable. Elena absorbed this information, adding it to the increasingly complicated picture she was forming. Why are you telling me this? Because you're smart enough to ask the right questions and observant enough to find the answers anyway. Better you hear it from me than piece together a narrative that's only half true. Vincent started walking back toward his office, and Elena fell into step beside him. And because Dante trusts you, which means you're going to see more of how we really operate, might as well understand what you're seeing. Does he trust me? Or is he testing me? Vincent smiled slightly. With Dante? Usually both. Back at the Sterling building that afternoon, Elena presented her findings to Dante in his private office. Unlike the conference room with its mahogany table and formal seating, this space was more personal. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive desk that looked antique, Artwork that was probably worth more than Elena's annual salary. Vincent told me about the conversation at the warehouse, Dante said once she'd finished her presentation. He was standing at the window, looking out at the city rather than at her. About what he shared regarding how I run things now. He thought I should understand the context. And do you? Understand? Elena chose her words carefully. I understand that you've implemented structure and rules in a world that typically operates without them. I understand that you see yourself as trying to minimize harm. Whether that actually absolves you of responsibility for the harm that still occurs? She let the sentence hang. Dante turned from the window, and there was something in his expression Elena couldn't quite read. It doesn't. Absolution isn't something I expect or deserve, but I can try to be less destructive than the alternatives. Is that why you changed? 8 years ago? Vincent mentioned an incident. A 9-year-old girl named Sofia Ramirez, Dante said quietly, and the pain in his voice was unmistakable. Wrong place, wrong time, caught in crossfire during a territorial dispute. She survived, but he stopped, took a breath. I went to the hospital. I saw what my world had done to an innocent kid, and I realized I could either accept that as the cost of doing business, or I could do better. This was the moment, Elena realized, where she should feel vindicated. Here was confirmation that Dante's world destroyed innocence. Here was proof that he acknowledged the damage he caused. She should feel her hatred crystallizing, becoming unshakable. Instead, she felt something far more complicated, an unwilling empathy for the man standing across from her, clearly still haunted by that day 8 years ago. Did you help her? The girl? Elena asked. Anonymous donation that covered her medical bills and set up a trust for her education. It doesn't fix what happened, but it was something. Dante moved to his desk, picking up a photograph in a silver frame that Elena hadn't noticed before. This is what I see every time I make a decision now. Sophia, smiling before that day, reminds me what's at stake when I choose violence over alternatives. Elena felt something shift inside her, some certainty she'd held on to for 10 years beginning to crack, because this didn't fit the narrative she'd constructed. The Dante Caruso she'd imagined didn't keep photographs of his victim's innocence, didn't restructure his entire organization to minimize harm, didn't carry visible guilt for collateral damage. But the real Dante Caruso, the man standing in front of her, apparently did all of those things. I should go, Elena said, suddenly desperate to leave, to process this in private. I have the final reports on the other facilities ready by tomorrow. Elena, his voice stopped her halfway to the door. Thank you for your work on this. I know it's not easy, seeing the ugly side of how I operate, but your analysis might have saved us from a much larger problem. I appreciate that. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and escaped to the elevator. That night, alone in her apartment with Cassie on her way over, Elena stared at her laptop screen and the encrypted folder labeled Project Justice. Inside were years of research, planning, certainty. Outside, in the real world, was a man who was nothing like she'd expected. Dante Caruso had destroyed her father. That remained true. But he was also human, capable of remorse, actively trying to be better than his nature demanded. That was also true, and Elena had no idea what to do with the contradiction. When Cassie arrived with Thai food and too many questions, Elena found herself unable to articulate what was happening. How could she explain that the man she'd sworn to destroy was becoming uncomfortably three-dimensional, that every conversation revealed layers of complexity that made her mission harder? You're falling for him, Cassie said quietly, setting down her pad Thai. I'm not, Ella. I've known you for 12 years. I know when you're conflicted about something, and you've never been conflicted about Dante Caruso before. I'm not falling for him, Elena insisted. I'm realizing the situation is more complicated than I thought. That doesn't change what he did. It just means I need to be smarter about how I approach this. Cassie looked skeptical but didn't push. Just promise me you'll be careful. Not just physically safe, emotionally careful. Revenge is a seductive story, Ella, but real life is messier than stories. And sometimes the villain turns out to be human too. After Cassie left, Elena opened her father's files, the documentation of his business, the correspondence with Caruso Holdings, the timeline of his destruction. She read through it all again, looking for certainty, for the clear, righteous anger that had sustained her for so long. It was still there, the evidence of her father's suffering, the injustice of what had happened, the loss that had shaped her entire adult life. But now, unwanted and unwelcome, there were questions too. Had her father really tried to go to the authorities? Or was that family mythology, a story they told themselves to maintain his innocence? What exactly had Antonio Moretti been transporting for Dante? How complicit had he actually been? And the most dangerous question of all, if the situation had been as simple as victim and villain, why had it taken 4 years for her father to try to escape? Elena closed the files, her head aching with confusion and exhaustion. She'd come into this mission with such clarity, such certainty about who was right and who was wrong. 3 weeks with Dante Caruso had shattered that certainty entirely, and she had no idea how to get it back. 6 weeks later, December, the first snow of winter fell on Manhattan like a whispered secret, transforming the city into something softer, quieter. Elena stood in Dante's private office, watching the flakes drift past the windows, aware that everything had changed and nothing had changed all at once. It was past midnight. They were alone, and she'd stopped pretending this was just business weeks ago. "You're thinking too loud," Dante said from his desk, where he was reviewing contracts she'd prepared. His jacket was draped over his chair, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, the most casual she'd ever seen him. "Whatever it is, just say it." Elena turned from the window. 2 months ago she would have calculated every word, measured every response. Now, exhausted from another 16-hour day, and dizzy from proximity to him, the truth slipped out. "I found something. In the old shipping records." His pen stopped moving. "What kind of something?" "References to the Moretti shipping line from 2015. She watched his face carefully, looking for recognition, guilt, anything. "Antonio Moretti. Does that name mean anything to you?" Dante set down his pen slowly, his expression unreadable. "Should it? You tell me. Your company had extensive dealings with Moretti Shipping between 2010 and 2015. Then suddenly nothing. The company dissolved, Antonio Moretti died, and his family disappeared." Elena's voice remained steady despite her racing heart. "I'm just curious about the pattern." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Outside, the snow continued falling, muffling the city sounds. "Why are you asking me this, Elena?" Dante's voice was quiet, careful. "After 2 months of working together, why bring up a defunct shipping company from a decade ago?" "Because I'm his daughter, and I've been lying to you from the beginning, and I don't know anymore if I'm here to destroy you or understand you." "Because I'm thorough," she said instead. "And because if I'm going to continue optimizing your operations, I need to understand your history, including the partnerships that failed." Dante stood, moving to the bar cart. He poured 2 glasses of scotch without asking, handed her one, and returned to the window. They stood side by side, looking out at the transformed city. "Antonio Moretti was a good man in a bad situation," Dante said finally. "He owned a legitimate shipping company. I approached him about a partnership, legal at first, then less so. He refused initially. I pressured him. Business wasn't personal then. It was just strategy." Elena's grip tightened on her glass. "What kind of pressure?" "The kind that made his problems multiply until working with me seemed like the only solution." Dante's voice carried something she'd never heard before. "Regret." He agreed. "Helped me move cargo for 4 years. Then he wanted out. Threatened to go to the authorities. I should have let him walk away. Instead, I made his life hell until what? Until he drank himself to death." Dante turned to look at her, and his eyes were full of something that looked like shame. "I didn't pull a trigger, Elena, but I killed him anyway. Added him to a list of people who got caught in my machinery and didn't survive." The admission hung in the air between them. Elena had waited 10 years to hear these words, to have confirmation of what she'd always known. So why did it feel like her foundation was crumbling instead of solidifying? "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. "Because you asked, and because you deserve honesty." He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, in a gesture so intimate it made her breath catch. "I've made a lot of mistakes, Elena. Destroyed a lot of people in the process of building this empire. I can't change that, but I can be honest about it with someone who matters." "I matter? You know you do." The space between them felt electric, dangerous. Elena knew she should step back, maintain distance, remember why she was really here. Instead, she moved closer. "This is a mistake," she said. "Probably." His hand cupped her face, thumb tracing her cheekbone. "Tell me to stop." She couldn't, because despite everything, despite the lies, the mission, the 10 years of hatred, she wanted this, wanted him. The realization was terrifying and liberating all at once. When he kissed her, gentle and questioning, Elena felt something inside her break open, Not her resolve exactly, but the rigid certainty that had defined her for so long. She kissed him back, pouring all her confusion and conflict and unwanted desire into the contact. It was Dante who pulled away first, resting his forehead against hers. We shouldn't. I know. This complicates everything. I know. But neither of them moved. Outside, the snow transformed the city into something new. Inside, Elena felt herself transforming too, from the girl who'd sworn revenge into someone she didn't recognize. Stay, Dante said softly. Not for work. Just stay. And Elena, abandoning every plan and promise, did. They talked through the night, curled up on the leather sofa in his office, the city lights and falling snow creating an intimate cocoon. Dante told her about building his empire from nothing, about the costs and compromises. Elena told him carefully edited versions of her life, real enough to feel honest, vague enough to protect her secrets. Do you ever regret it? She asked as dawn approached. The path you chose? Every day, he admitted. But regret doesn't change anything. You play the hand you're dealt, make the best choices you can, and live with the consequences. That's a lonely way to exist. It was. He pulled her closer. Less so now. Elena closed her eyes, allowing herself this moment of peace before the inevitable complications crashed down. Because they would. She knew that. You couldn't build something real on a foundation of lies. But for now, with snow falling outside and Dante's heartbeat steady beneath her ear, she let herself forget. Forget the mission. Forget the past. Forget everything except the impossible present, where the man she'd sworn to destroy had somehow become the person who made her feel most alive. When her phone buzzed with a text from Cassie, "Where are you?" reality intruded again. Elena extracted herself carefully, gathering her things. "I should go," she said. "Elena," Dante caught her hand. "Whatever this is between us, it's complicated. Everything worth having is." She kissed him once more, quick and desperate, then left before she could change her mind. In the elevator, descending toward the snowy streets, Elena finally let herself feel the full weight of what had happened. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and somewhere in the process her mission of revenge had become something far more dangerous. She'd started to fall in love with Dante Caruso, the man who'd destroyed her father, the man who'd just confessed to that destruction, showing remorse and humanity, the man who was still a criminal, still dangerous, still everything she should hate. But Elena didn't hate him anymore. That was the truth she could no longer deny, and she had no idea what to do about it. Outside, the snow continued falling, covering old tracks and creating space for new paths. Elena stood on the corner, watching the city wake up, and wondered if redemption was possible for either of them, or if they were both too damaged by their pasts to build any kind of future. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Dante. "Be careful in the snow. Text me when you're home." Such a simple message. Such ordinary care. From a man who was anything but ordinary. Elena hailed a taxi, her heart heavy with impossible choices, and headed home to face whatever came next. 2 weeks later, the evidence sat on Elena's dining table like an accusation. 3 file folders, a laptop, and 10 years of carefully constructed lies about to come crashing down. Outside her Brooklyn apartment, the city moved through its late December rhythms, indifferent to the fact that her entire world was about to implode. Cassie paced behind her, coffee mug clutched in both hands. "You have to tell him, before he finds out on his own." "Tell him what exactly?" Elena's voice was hollow. "That I'm actually Isabella Moretti? That I've been lying since the moment we met? That I came into his life specifically to destroy him?" "Yes, all of that." Cassie stopped pacing. "Ella, you're in love with him. That changes everything." Before Elena could respond, her phone rang. Dante's name lit up the screen. She answered, forcing brightness into her voice. "Hey, I need you to come to the Sterling building." Dante's voice was tight, controlled in a way that made Elena's stomach drop. "Now, my office. Don't talk to anyone else." He hung up before she could ask more questions. Elena stared at her phone, ice flooding her veins. He knows something. The 20-minute drive into Manhattan felt like hours. The Sterling building's lobby was nearly empty on a Saturday afternoon. Elena's heels clicked against marble as she hurried to the private elevator. His office door was closed. She knocked once, her heart hammering. "Come in." Dante stood at the window with his back to her, shoulders tense. On his desk sat a file folder, cream-colored, slightly worn, her father's business correspondence from 2015. "Sit down, Elena." Dante's voice was eerily calm. Or should I say, Isabella? The world tilted. Elena grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself. How long have you known? 2 weeks. He finally turned to face her, expression terrifyingly blank. My head of security ran a background check. Facial recognition took about 30 seconds. Isabella Moretti, daughter of Antonio Moretti, the man I destroyed. You created Elena Russo, got yourself hired at Meridian, positioned yourself perfectly to gather evidence against me. He moved to his desk, opening the folder. The question is why I waited. Why I didn't confront you immediately. Elena's throat was too tight to speak. I wanted to see if you'd tell me yourself. If whatever was happening between us was real enough for you to choose honesty. His laugh was bitter. Guess I have my answer. I was going to tell you. When? After you'd gathered enough evidence to destroy me? I told you about your father, admitted what I'd done, and you said nothing. He moved closer, anger burning beneath the surface. Was any of it real? Or was the relationship just part of your plan? It was supposed to be. Elena's voice broke. But then I got to know you, and you weren't the monster I'd imagined. You were complicated and trying to be better, and I didn't know what to do with that. So you kept lying. Yes, because I'd built my entire adult identity around hating you. And suddenly I couldn't anymore. Tears streamed down Elena's face. Do you know what that's like? To have your whole purpose dissolve because reality refuses to be as simple as you need it to be? Dante's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained hard. I thought I'd finally found someone who saw past the criminal to the person underneath, someone I could trust. But it was all manipulation. Not all of it. Elena pulled out her phone, opening her encrypted files. Look. This is everything I gathered on you. Business deals, financial records, shipping manifests, months of work. And here's my plan for exposing you. She navigated to another folder. I stopped adding to it 6 weeks ago. After that night in your office, I couldn't do it anymore. Because destroying you stopped being justice and started being cruelty. Dante scrolled through her documentation, face impassive. So what was your plan? Just pretend forever? I don't know. I was 18 when my father died, Dante. 18 and furious and broken. I built this mission around that rage because it was the only thing that made sense. But rage doesn't sustain you forever. Dante moved to the window again. Snow had started falling, turning Manhattan into a monochrome photograph. I believe the feelings were real, but you had dozens of opportunities to tell me the truth. Every moment of intimacy, every time I opened up about my past. You chose deception every single time. Because I was terrified of losing you. Terrified that if I told you the truth, you'd look at me exactly the way you're looking at me right now. Like someone who betrayed my trust. Like I'm not worth saving. The words hung between them, vulnerable and true. Dante turned from the window, conflict visible in his eyes. I need time, he said finally. Time to figure out if there's anything left to salvage. You finished the consulting contract professionally. But whatever was happening between us, that's done until I can think clearly. Dante, please, just go, Isabella. Before I say something I'll regret. Elena gathered her things slowly, hoping he'd call her back. He didn't. In the elevator, she finally collapsed, sobs tearing through her chest. She'd known this moment was coming, but knowing didn't make it hurt less. Back home, Cassie provided silent support as Elena finally opened the last file, her father's journal from those final months. She'd read it once, 10 years ago, but never since. Too painful. Now she forced herself to read. The entries were sporadic, increasingly incoherent. But threaded through the despair was something Elena had forgotten. Dante offered me a way out. New city, clean slate, enough money to start over. I told him no. How can I run from what I've become? The first shipment, I knew what I was transporting. I told myself it was temporary. 4 years later, here I am. Dante isn't the monster I need him to be. He's just a man surviving. I hate him for giving me options, but I hate myself more for taking them. Elena read the entries twice, her understanding crumbling. Her father hadn't been forced into Dante's world. Not entirely. He'd made choices, complicated ones, and struggled with consequences. "Oh, Papa," she whispered. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her phone rang. Unknown number. "Ms. Russo, this is Vincent Torres. We need to talk. Tonight. About the night Antonio Moretti died. 4 hours later, the diner in Queens was far from Manhattan's towers. Vincent sat across from Elena in a corner booth, coffee cooling between them. "Dante doesn't know I'm here," Vincent said. But you deserve the truth. I was there the night before your father died. Antonio called Dante, said he needed to talk. We thought he was going to turn state's evidence. Elena's hands clenched around her mug. And? Your father wasn't trying to betray us. He was suicidal. Told Dante he couldn't live with what he'd become, how he'd destroyed his family's reputation. He begged Dante to kill him, said it would be cleaner that way. No, Dante talked him down, offered him money to disappear and start over. Your father refused, said disappearing would be cowardice. Vincent's voice was gentle. Dante left him alive, Ms. Russo. Whatever happened after, that wasn't Dante's doing. The medical examiner ruled it alcohol poisoning. Your father made that choice. Why are you telling me this now? Because Dante's been carrying your father's death as his sin for 10 years, and now you come into his life for revenge. Vincent leaned forward. Maybe it's time you both stop being haunted by a ghost. After Vincent left, Elena sat alone, trying to process everything. Her father's journal, Vincent's revelation, the complete dissolution of her narrative. Antonio Moretti hadn't been murdered by Dante Caruso. He'd been destroyed by his own choices, his own inability to reconcile who he was with who he'd wanted to be. And Elena had spent 10 years hating the wrong person or hating him for the wrong reasons. Her phone showed one text from an unknown number. Rooftop garden, midnight, please. D. Elena looked at the time. 11:47 p.m. She had 13 minutes to decide if she was going to fight for what they'd had, or accept that some betrayals were too fundamental to overcome. Outside, snow fell steadily, covering everything in white. Elena paid for her untouched coffee and headed back into the storm. Midnight. Rooftop garden. The rooftop garden was transformed by snow, city lights reflecting off white surfaces like scattered diamonds. Elena found Dante at the edge, looking out at Manhattan's glittering expanse. You came, he said quietly, not turning around. I almost didn't. Elena moved beside him, maintaining careful distance. Vincent told me what happened, what my father really asked you to do. He had no right. He had every right. I needed to know the truth. She pulled out her father's journal, holding it between them. I read this tonight. Really read it. For the first time since he died. He wasn't the victim I needed him to be. And you weren't the villain. Dante finally looked at her. Pain etched in his features. I still gave him the choice that destroyed him. I still pressured him into my world. And he still made his own decisions. Complicated, terrible decisions that ate him alive. Elena's voice cracked. I spent 10 years hating you for something that was more complex than I wanted to believe. I needed you to be a monster because it was easier than accepting my father's complicity in his own destruction. So where does that leave us? I don't know. Elena turned to face him fully. I lied to you, manipulated you, came into your life with the sole purpose of destroying you. And somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you instead. That doesn't erase what I did. No, it doesn't. Dante's voice was rough. But I've done worse things for worse reasons. I built an empire on other people's weaknesses. Your father wasn't my only casualty, just the one that finally caught up with me. What are you saying? I'm saying maybe we're both too damaged to deserve redemption. But maybe that's exactly why we understand each other. He reached for her hand, tentative. I don't forgive you. Not yet. And you don't forgive me. But maybe we can work toward something that looks like forgiveness. That's not exactly a fairy tale ending. We're not fairy tale people, Isabella. He used her real name deliberately, an acknowledgement of truth. We're messy and complicated and carrying too much history. But we're also here in the snow, refusing to walk away. Elena looked at their joined hands, then up at his face. This won't be easy. Nothing worth having is. I'll have to tell Meridian the truth. Probably lose my job. You'll find another one, or... Dante hesitated. You could work for me directly. Put that brilliant mind to legitimate use. Help me expand the legal side of operations. No more shadows. You'd trust me after everything? Eventually. Trust is rebuilt slowly. But yes, I'd trust you. He pulled her closer. Question is, can you trust me? Can you look at me and see something other than the man who destroyed your father? I see the man who's trying to be better than his past. The man who keeps a photograph of Sofia Ramirez to remind himself what's at stake. The man who offered my father a way out even when he didn't have to. Elena reached up, touching his face. I see you, Dante. All of you. The good and the terrible and everything in between. That's more than I deserve. Probably. But I'm not exactly innocent either. He kissed her then, soft and questioning, and Elena felt something settle inside her. Not peace exactly, that would take time. but possibility. The chance to build something real on a foundation of painful honesty, rather than comfortable lies. When they pulled apart, snow was falling heavier, muffling the city sounds. What happens now? Elena asked. Now we try. We stumble through this mess we've made and see if there's something worth salvaging on the other side. Dante wrapped his arms around her. And maybe eventually we figure out how to forgive ourselves as much as each other. Elena leaned into him, looking out at the city that had both raised and ruined them both. Somewhere below, millions of people were living their complicated lives, making their own impossible choices. She and Dante were just two more broken people trying to find redemption in an unforgiving world. But they were trying together, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough.